You watch the news and think you're receiving information, but in reality your mind is being shaped. When Iran is constantly sold as the aggressor while the causes disappear, that's no longer neutral reporting. It's a moral packaging of reality. There are conflicts where you're not simply being updated, but quietly molded from the inside. And that's exactly where it becomes dangerous. Because at some point, you no longer notice what you truly know and what you've simply heard often enough. As a Muslim, you have a duty here that is far too often forgotten. The duty to truth. Not only to speak truth, but to seek it, test it, and refuse to trade it for comfort. Because once you get used to being handed a finished story, your judgment becomes lazy. And lazy judgment is the best soil for injustice to grow. We can see this clearly in the Iran conflict right now. It's not that something just happens and then it gets analyzed. The framing is often decided before anyone even asks about causes. You hear escalation, aggression, danger. And while you're still trying to understand what the origin was, the moral template has already been placed over the topic. And if you say, well, that's just how the media works, then that's precisely the numbness you must protect yourself from. Because the same structure has repeated for decades. Bombing, destruction, intervention, and in the end, the bombers are presented as protectors, while those who respond or defend themselves are automatically treated as the threat. In this video, the goal is not to glorify any country or blindly cheer for anyone. The goal is to recognize patterns that are visible, recurring, and ultimately designed to produce the same outcome every time. That you stop seeking truth and settle for a story because it feels easier. If you look honestly, you'll recognize a routine that works frighteningly well. There is always a moral stage. There are always roles assigned. And those roles are often distributed long before you even know the backstory. You've seen this pattern over the last decades. Every time it's security, stability, values, necessity. And then comes what later gets labeled as tragic collateral. Countries shattered, societies torn apart, infrastructure collapsed, generations raised in ruins. Yet the central narrative remains stable. The ones who act do it for the good. The ones who suffer or react are complicated, problematic, or dangerous. That is not just a political problem, it's a trap for the mind. Because when you hear this script often enough, your brain begins to cooperate automatically. You hear intervention and think rescue. You hear retaliation and think barbarism. You hear self-defense and stop asking who threw the first stone, because that part is barely discussed. This is exactly how Iran is often portrayed today. It is presented as the source of instability, as if it just escalates, as if it threatens without cause. And if you try to look calmly at what actually happened beforehand, you notice the origin is either mentioned briefly or shrunk until it no longer matters in the moral story. That's not an accident, that's the method. Because once people start seeing causes, it becomes harder to keep assigning roles cleanly. Then someone might ask, who attacked first? Who provoked first? Who has the capacity to station military power across the world? And who benefits from entire regions remaining on fire? The Quran trains you against this numbness, not by throwing you into paranoia, but by teaching you that you cannot believe something just because it is loud, or accept it just because it is repeated. And you cannot hand over your moral compass simply because it is more comfortable. Because the Quran does not train you to be loyal to headlines. It trains you to be loyal to truth, even when truth is unpopular, even when it isolates you, even when it makes you difficult in rooms that prefer silence. And this is exactly how deception wins. Most people think a lie is simply a false statement. But the more refined form is not the open lie, it is guided truth. You are shown pieces, but not the order. You are shown images, but not the context. You are shown the reaction, but not the cause. And then comes the strongest tool of all, repetition. When you hear the same interpretation every day, it eventually gets stored in your mind as knowledge. Not because you tested it, but because your brain begins to assume if everyone says it the same way, it must be true. Here's what makes it even more deceptive. To appear credible, some real facts are allowed through. Not out of honesty, but to create the impression of balance. A little truth here, a little critique there, and suddenly the whole package looks fair, even though the overall direction remains the same. You can see this method beyond Iran too. Take the Epstein files as an example. What became visible was shocking, but it was also clearly controlled. Some things were revealed, but not everything. Certain connections surfaced, but much remained blacked out. And that should raise a question. If institutions truly wanted radical transparency, why is so much curated? Why does the topic disappear so quickly in the mainstream, even though it should be a political earthquake? It's the same mechanism. Give the public just enough so it doesn't explode, but not enough to understand the system. And that's why it's dangerous to get used to the finished story. You are not only being informed, you are being guided. If you notice that when Iran is mentioned, you immediately feel programmed reflexes, they're dangerous, they're escalating, they're threatening, without having examined the sequence of events, that is not clarity. That is a sign your thinking has already been placed on rails. And as a Muslim, you cannot live on rails. Not because you are better, but because without independent moral judgment, you will eventually stop being just. And once you lose justice, you lose the core of your religion. One point is crucial today because it is constantly exploited: division. You are pushed to believe the real issue is internal conflict, camps, identities, old rivalries. Yes, differences exist, but what is happening right now is bigger than that. When war is being waged against the Muslim world, the aggressor does not care whether you are Shia or Sunni. What matters to them is that you believe in the Quran, that you have limits, that you have a moral framework that cannot be endlessly bent. What matters is that you can't do many things that a limitless global system and a limitless culture industry would prefer. That's why priorities must be clear. First, you recognize the external assault, the structures that destabilize regions, the narratives that always move in the same direction. Then, when the existential threat is no longer hanging over the Ummah, Muslims can sit down internally and discuss sincerely with knowledge and adab. But if you argue about carpet colors while the house is on fire, you have missed the principle. Islam doesn't ask you to be blind, it asks you to be clear. Clear in your scale, clear in your language, clear in understanding that justice does not come from Washington or Tel Aviv. but from a standard higher than power. And yes, it also means you must stop accepting freedom as automatically good simply because it is marketed that way. Many things sold as freedom today destroy families, destroy hearts, destroy meaning. And then societies wonder why, despite wealth, they feel empty. Islam has answers, not as nostalgia, but as medicine. Yet that medicine is often labeled backward, so you won't even try it. Islam's guidance is not an enemy of freedom. It is a protection of what freedom is for. A heart that is not owned by trends, a life that is not ruled by addiction, and a soul that is not dragged by every urge. Now comes the uncomfortable part, because it concerns you. It is not enough to be vaguely skeptical inside. It is not enough to think once a month, something isn't right. You must understand that living in an era of constant manipulation is itself a test. The test is not only what happens in Iran. The test is also what it does to you. Whether you go numb, whether you eventually say, I can't see this anymore, whether you pull away because ignorance feels psychologically easier, or whether you say, I stay awake without becoming hysterical, I stay just without becoming blind, I stay truthful without destroying myself. That is the Islamic way. Clarity without madness. Stance without chaos, truth without self-destruction. And that stance has consequences, because if you take truth seriously, you must accept that you won't always be loved for it. Sometimes you'll be mocked. Sometimes you'll be pushed into a corner. Sometimes you'll be called extreme, simply for asking questions that are uncomfortable. But this is where you discover whether you are free or dependent. Dependent on applause, dependent on social approval, dependent on what is safe to say, or free because your standard is with Allah. That is the point where your thinking becomes clean again, not because you know everything, but because you've learned not to swallow everything. If you want to take one thing from this, take this. The pattern is not new, the role assignment is not new, and the method is not new. Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya. Again and again, a moral outfit was placed over destruction. And again the world was told that the ones dropping bombs are creating order, while the ones responding are automatically the danger. That is why you must be careful with the Iran narrative. Not because Iran is sacred, but because truth is sacred. Because justice is sacred. And because Allah will not ask you whether you believed the most comfortable version. He will ask whether you stayed just when the world tried to train you into something else. And here is the line I want to leave you with, because it should hit like a strike. If you get used to injustice being sold as morality today, don't be surprised when tomorrow you no longer recognize your own voice.